Okay, everybody, we're going to sit down and dive right in. I'm really excited to have as our first guest for the second part of the morning, Nate Silver. Nate is a great example of how generative the internet and political scene is, because if Twitter didn't exist in a significant fashion, maybe two and a half years ago, YouTube didn't exist 4 years ago. Well, Nate Silver didn't exist a year ago, or just about a year ago, right? I mean, Nate was a baseball statistician par excellence who started blogging on Daily Kos during the primaries and as Poblano, right? Poblano. And when exactly did you unplug and start 538?
In like about a year ago, like probably May or June, I think, of last year. It was when it became difficult to, people weren't going to quote someone named Poblano in a newspaper or something, and so editing became disadvantageous, kind of financially and otherwise after some point.
Right, and 538.com took off like a rocket, and by election day, it was one of the top political blogs in the country in terms of hits, and not just hits, but influence, and, because you were forecasting the primaries so accurately, and then really giving people the ability to understand the polling about the general election. Everybody seemed to want that. Have you had a big drop since then?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I mean, it was kind of really too good to be true for a while, where you go, because it's not linear exactly, so you don't go from having 1,000 to 2,000, you have to go from 1,000 hits a day to 10,000, then we went from kind of 10,000 to 100,000, and finally up to 3 million, I think, on election day. And but about 2/3, 3/4 of people were there for the election and the election only, and they kind of watched the Al Franken thing, and then they left. But that's okay. We were an election site. We still are getting a lot of traffic now. It's more fun now. In certain ways, we can riff on healthcare, or the climate bill, or Iran, or Starbucks, or just kind of whatever you're in the mood to do, instead of having to write about the polls every day. When I know it's very exciting to a lot of people, but it gets kind of tedious. You're like, here's another poll, it's a crappy poll, like all the other polls. It's Obama's going to win, it's okay. Now in some ways, it's really highly uncertain. I don't know if we're going to get a healthcare bill or a climate bill this year. I think everything is kind of up in the air. We realize like governing really is the hard part.
Governing is the hard part, and maybe we'll come back to that thought. But I wanted to ask you, and I really wanted to use this time that we have together to focus on maybe you offering us your reality check. There's a lot of people here who think the internet is really transforming the political process, and for the sake of this conversation, let's focus on the election part of that process,
right,
as opposed to governing. How much do you really think has changed, given that demographics, past, voting patterns are really so predictive? They seem to be highly predictive of what will likely happen going forward. So how much do you think the internet is a game changer, and how much of this is hype?
Yeah, I mean, this is probably true that if you didn't have the internet, if Al Gore hadn't invented it, then Barack Obama still would probably be on track to win the election last year, where you had a deeply unpopular president, you had a very bad recession, the party had been out of power for a long time. I mean, yeah, he was, I think, the favorite going in, but the primaries in some ways are where it was more interesting, because it clearly wasn't, at least at first, a favorite against Hillary, at least the kind of the conventional wisdom. I think he was always a strong candidate. But that's really where you kind of saw the new media strategy versus the old media strategy, and we saw who, barely, but won out eventually.
Well, I've certainly made the argument that if it were not for how Obama used the internet and how the internet, or how people on the internet rallied around Obama, that Hillary would have been the presidential nominee of the Democratic Party, because of how much both money, the sort of deeper financial base that Obama built, and the broader volunteer base. And when you remember how tight the primary fight was between him and Hillary, it was his ability to contest and win caucus states.
Yep.
And that, I think, had something to do with all those volunteer groups in those caucus states that in some cases were active well before the professional campaign came in. So do you agree? Do you think the internet was the deciding factor between?
I agree. I mean, I think the caucus states were probably the deciding factor in the primaries,
Right.
and to be able to organize them and, really cleaned her clock. I mean, he beat her in states like Idaho, by margins of 4-1, and won as many delegates there almost a net gain as she got from winning California by 9 points or whatever. Winning a small state by 80 points, it really adds up the way the math works. Just to understanding the process overall, the fact, for example, this whole idea of superdelegates, who now they're debating maybe getting rid of or at least cutting their numbers. I mean, that was something where if people didn't understand as much about the process maybe 4 or 8 years ago, that might have been more of an advantage for Clinton, but where there was more transparency, where you knew the superdelegates' names, where you knew it had kind of exact counts and you didn't have to rely on the media to report things and make this all mysterious, I think that might have played a role. I mean, things like, YouTube, the kind of hundreds of millions of dollars in free advertising impressions he got from that over and over again. I mean, there are a ton of things that all kind of add up, and because it was really so close, I mean, it doesn't take that much to push you past the tipping point, but clearly they understood how to use the internet, and I think Hillary was relying on Mark Penn, who was kind of very much really an old media figure still.
Do you think that overall, the data seems to suggest that at least through 2008, the Democrats online, while the number of Democrats online versus the number of Republicans online is pretty even, according to Pew.
Right.
The activist core, there are more Democrats using the internet for political organizing, raising money, organizing groups, and so on, or just creating and sharing information than Republicans. Do you think that's a significant advantage? Do you think it's going to last? What do you see, as we now head into the next cycle?
Well, part of it is generation, where the internet skews a little bit younger, although not as young as people think, and so does, democratic behavior and activism and all these things kind of go together. I think part of it is that in some ways it's kind of our Democrats equivalent of kind of right-wing talk radio. I mean, that seemed to be a medium which is not something that, frankly, I listen to a lot, but is still very important in the conversations that they have, I think, to one another. But, I think it's partly because people were fed up with Bush, was a lot of it, and I think you are going to see more kind of green shoots, I guess, kind of in the right-wing blogosphere a little bit more. I actually think, I know a lot of people on the left disagree. I thought the Tea Parties were somewhat impressive as a thing of where you would actually get 2,000 people to go out in some small town in the middle of Utah.
These are for folks who maybe don't remember, around Tax Day, it was a movement to throw Tea Party's protest, I guess, for Obama's plans to expand government.
Yeah, it was a different, and the message wasn't all that organized. I liken it a little bit to maybe where the left was at kind of before the Iraq War and Katrina and these other kind of unifying issues. But from an organizational standpoint, it wasn't that easy to get 700 different, or however many rallies they had in different cities, and some of them literally were like 8 people. I went through and collected the news accounts where there were 8 people at the shopping center today. But others they had several hundred. They didn't have any really large ones like a Democrat might have because red states tend to be more rural. People are concentrated in smaller cities, but still, I think there's a little bit of life there, I think, potentially.
Now, let's talk brass tacks. The Democrats have this online fundraising powerhouse called Act Blue, which I think people used. Folks who don't know, Act Blue is basically do-it-yourself political action committee. You can create an account, start raising money on behalf of a candidate, and Act Blue does all the back-end work for you in terms of the FEC filings. And so it's a real hub for small donors. And I think they raised about $85 million for several thousand Democratic candidates in 2008. The Republican efforts, there are a couple, but Slate Card, I think, David All is somewhere in here, you could correct me, is at least 2 to 4 years behind in terms of the intensity of impact. Do you think that the Democratic advantage in online fundraising is significant? Do you see it helping people at the congressional level?
I think it has helped people. I think one disadvantage the Republicans have is that they're not very fond of their own party, believe it or not. If you ask Republicans, do you like the Republican Party right now, about 40% will say no, and so something like this climate bill, which the House passed on Friday, they're really angry at the 8 Republicans who voted for that bill. And so you might see fundraising efforts to, for a primary challenge to get them out, but I think some of their energies, certainly with the race down in Florida, where Charlie Crist is opposed by the more conservative part of the party, you'll see this really writ large, obviously, when we get to the nomination process in 2012. But, usually when a party loses, they go through an identity crisis and have a couple of years where they're kind of, in the wilderness and deciding what their new identity might be. I think also Democrats shouldn't get too complacent because there are a lot of problems that Barack Obama inherited, and he made a lot of promises, I think, and that can be a fairly pernicious combination.
At some point, he can't keep blaming Bush for
you
his
can't,
inheritance.
and you can see this, and there's other kind of posts of meaning to do but haven't, but you can kind of see the expectations on the economy, rise very, very slowly, and the economy's maybe getting better a little bit, and then maybe it's not so much anymore, and he's kind of, he's being graded on a curve, but the curve gets just a little steeper day by day by day. And eventually, he is going to be blamed for the problems. I mean, the fact is you kind of go out on the campaign trail, you promise at different times, well, we're going to cut taxes, we're going to, cut deficits, and we're going to spend more on all these programs. You can't really do all three of those things unless you have kind of a Clinton-era kind of economic boom, which is a unique set of circumstances in American history, really. So one of those things will be broken, one of those three kind of, legs of the stool, at least one, and that'll give some kind of angle for the Republicans.
It could, though, as Democrats, I think, as Netroots Democrats used to say, it's awfully hard to beat something with nothing. So it may be that Obama will face more problems, but until the Republicans unify around a message, a leader, you think if you're handicapping 2012...
Well, the fact that so many of their candidates are recycled from last time, there's this whole kind of next in line theory about, I think John McCain was frankly by far and away the best choice they could have made, in terms of who their nominee would be, and and he lost by 7.3 points or whatever it wound up being, and granted it was a tough environment for them overall, but I don't think Mitt Romney's going to become our president someday particularly. I don't know about Sarah Palin. I think she at least gets people excited and enthusiastic, and she will raise a ton of money. But I really think the next Republican president, maybe not the next nominee, will be someone that we haven't really heard about a lot, and someone we haven't thought about a lot, but someone who, at least seems a little bit fresher.
And probably not someone hiking on the Appalachian Trail.
Probably not. But he was really in love, at least. It wasn't like the affair is past. Like, I'm still in love right now. It's a big problem, guys.
I have one more question, but I wanted to make sure that the audience gets a chance if anybody wants to jump in, because we only have 6-7 minutes left with Nate. So if you have a question, go down to the mics here. Nate, after the election, you and I emailed back and forth a little bit to try and figure out the demographics of the presidential race, because the youth vote broke so heavily to Obama. And I can't remember the exact numbers, but if you assume current mortality rates, the McCain vote shrinks by something like, what did we say, 15,000 a day or something, and that with 18-year-olds, the next cohort of 18-year-olds coming into the electorate, even though they don't vote at as high rate, the Obama vote is like growing at a much faster pace. So, were the election to be held today and you just apply the same demographics, it would be a bigger landslide for Obama, right? I mean, are we...
Yeah, it's what I call the Reader's Digest problem, which is your, demographic keeps dying a little bit at a time, your subscriber base, but...
Yeah, the Republican subscriber base needs to be renewed from somewhere. Where might that be?
I don't know, and I think they have to, ultimately it's going to boil down to the kind of policies they're advancing. The thing about this, talk about deficits, for example, I don't think it's a bad strategy at all, really, for winning over some larger fraction of kind of white middle-class voters, but it's not really what people under the age of 30 care about terribly much. You know, I mean, at some point they have to, you know, drop. I mean, you know, they debate the climate bill on Friday, and I watch C-SPAN because I'm a dork, and like people, I mean, you know, you have half the Republican delegation in the House saying global warming doesn't exist. Why would we pass this bill when the Earth is still getting cooler, apparently? You know, they have to drop that kind of stuff. They have to drop, I think, the, you know, opposition to gay marriage, which is changing not overnight. People overestimate the idea of a paradigm shift. It's more generational and kind of slow, but, you know, every 4 years it becomes a worse and worse issue for them, and I think kind of hurts their brand in a lot of ways overall. You know, they have to, you know, get with, you know, not, I mean, the problem is they assume, well, hey, we can talk about fiscal responsibility and go back and find our next Reagan and kind of do the same old thing, and in the short run, that's always easier. In the short run, it might win them a few extra seats in the House, I think, next year. But in the long run, they need something, you know, that's pretty radically different because, you know, there's a lot of evidence that people stay with their, you know, the identity that you develop politically when you're young, when you're 18, 25, 30, 33, tends to stick with you for, you know, the rest of your life. You can still kind of see the mark of the Reagan generation, and he was very popular on Generation X, where people who are kind of maybe, you know, late 30s, kind of early 40s are actually more Republican than people either on one side or the other of the age kind of curve. So, you know, it's a lasting damage, I think, that Bush has done.
Let's take a quick question. Oh, somebody over here? Yes?
Thank you. So this isn't really so relevant.
Tell us who you are first.
I'm sorry, my name is Eric Mell. I'm with the Sunlight Foundation. This isn't so relevant now, but back during the presidential election, you guys produced a lot of really interesting and valuable numbers, but a lot of them, and sort of technically speaking, they're all locked up in image files. And I was wondering if maybe, you know, coming up this next cycle, when you start really outputting the numbers again, if you have any interest in making those numbers available, you know, through an API or through any sort of feeds or any sort of non-image ways that other people can sort of take what they want and play around with it.
Yeah, a lot of the, I mean, a lot of what seems like it's like clever, some proprietary strategy on the side is just because I'm kind of was doing this all myself. I mean, basically, my process was I would create a chart in Microsoft Excel, try to make it look like it wasn't an ugly Excel chart.
So if somebody volunteered to help you, Nate, with making your data more available, would you be happy to take that help?
I think I'm being a politician. I don't want to make a total 100% commitment to it, but yeah, I think in general, I mean, you know, this, especially the polling data, is supposed to be open. There's no kind of secret sauce. No, we're running the numbers, crunching the numbers, but you know, there was no. Yeah, I mean, it was just because of my process where it was uploaded to a Flickr account. And Flickr, by the way, didn't like that very much after a while. But you know, that's why it was just a big, it was a big like .png files because that was the only way I could figure out how to do it with the kind of tools I had available.
Okay. Yes.
David Eisenberg from Eisen.com and Freedom to Connect. My question is about public opinion and climate change. Climate change is not sexy. People don't care compared to how much they care about an election or current Iran, current events, etc. As someone who watches the numbers and has sort of your finger on the pulse of public sentiment, what would your advice be for how to increase or what do you see about climate change in public opinion?
Pray for warm weather. There's some evidence that people are fairly sensitive to relatively small fluctuations in temperature. And we had, last year was not cool. Historically, it was relatively warm, but not as warm as we had you know, in kind of the early part of the 2000s. We have different solar cycles. I mean, eventually I think what we're going to have is we're going to have a summer where just everything kind of goes to hell. And it's like 108 degrees in, you know, Boston in May. Yeah, you know. And I think that might motivate things. I think the fact that the economy's, you know, bad right now. I mean, you can actually see, I've done some modeling of who voted for this bill in the House and who didn't, and if the unemployment rate is higher in your district, you're less likely to vote for it. You know, the amount of carbon output you get, obviously, we look at kind of lobbying contributions too, but, you know, in some ways I think it's actually somewhat remarkable that they got this bill passed, you know, only by a couple of votes in the middle of the worst recession we've had since, you know, in the last 50 years at least.
Right.
You
Time
know.
for, we'll take very quickly one last question.
Hello. So my question is about your observation about the rising expectations on Obama's promise there. By the way, my name is Barnaby. I'm from GovNext, so we make a tool to help citizens rate and track how well they're keeping their politicians' promises. So since you're a stats guy, how do you measure that rise that you talked about, that people are slowly sort of shifting that expectation upwards?
Well, I think back in February, NBC and the Wall Street Journal kind of conducted a poll when they asked people, when do you expect the recession to be over? And I'm trying to do some work to kind of model that vis-a-vis looking at, Gallup and Rasmussen, kind of track people's opinion about the economy and say, how much progress should it be making? And basically what it is that half the people think the recession should be over by the midterm elections, more or less, right? So that's kind of the benchmark. We have to be halfway to recovery for him to be kind of staying ahead of pace. And right now, I'm not sure if we're really there. It seemed like, you kind of had a fair amount of good news in March, and the stock market picked up about 15%. Not that it's the best indicator by any means. But since then, kind of things have been stagnant, and you've seen Obama's not any kind of catastrophic decline in his numbers, but he's gone from maybe 62% approval to 57%, and you get a little bit more nervous about certain things. And the economy just hasn't recovered at all, and even in March, it might have been kind of some false promise. But you can actually kind of track the day-by-day economic numbers, even the stock market to day-by-day fluctuations in his approval. I've tried to do this, and there is a correlation. You can kind of hypothesize what his approval will be if the stock market is, say, if the Dow's at 9,500 in November 2010, what it means for the Democrats in the midterm elections.
Well, these are really important questions. We can't resolve them all today, but thank you, Nate. We appreciate you offering your insights, and we'll keep reading you at 538. And I assume you have 539 and 540.
No, some enterprising entrepreneur took 539, I think. Although thanks to, we're going to actually probably have a 539 electoral vote, but
That's
thanks
why
to,
I asked.
Yeah, thanks to the Blippa process where the NRA tried to get this amendment passed and the kind of DC voting rights bill, and now the House Democrats won't vote for it, so yeah.
So you're
I
good
think
for now.
538's been spared for horrible reasons, but yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much.